What's up, my Canadian cousins, and welcome back. You may have noticed I am not in my normal studio, my home bar studio. It's a weekend and there's a lot going on in the house, and this is the only quiet spot I could choose. So forgive the lack of pizzazz to my little space. Anyway, I am going to be reacting to the Canadian caper, and this is, of course, about the operation led by the Canadian embassy during the Iran hostage crisis in the late 1970s. I believe it was 1979. And Ambassador Ken Taylor's efforts to get the Americans that they were harboring in the Canadian embassy to safety. Of course, I do know that the movie Argo attempts to depict this, but it upset a lot of Canadians because it perhaps undervalued, not perhaps, but for sure undervalued the Canadian participation, which was almost complete, and they were really the leaders of it, as I understand it, and overestimated the participation by the CIA operative that was portrayed by Ben Affleck. And, you know, movies do this, unfortunately. You have to watch a movie with historical subject matter with a grain of salt and kind of study on your own. But I understand why it upsets people. You know, the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson upset a lot of British people because of the way they depicted certain incidences of brutality. And there was brutality in that war on both sides, but particularly the fictitious Tavington, who was based on a real dragoon called Bannister Tarleton, who was rather brutal, but he never did anything like locking up men, women, and children in a church and burning them all to death. I think that they loosely got that from something that the Nazis did in World War II. And so to put that in a movie and have people believe that that was true is, I think, somewhat irresponsible, but I guess there is some responsibility on behalf of we, the viewers, to look into the historical accuracy of it. At the same time, it is irritating, and I do understand that. So there are a lot of videos about this subject matter. They're all pretty long. I'm hoping that this will whet my appetite for a deeper dive into it, and I can see what I will learn here. This is called the Canadian caper. It's relatively short, but I think it's going to maybe correct the record somewhat. And from there, I noticed that in researching this topic, that there are a lot of interviews with Ken Taylor. There are a few that are relatively short, and I think I might add one of those to the end. All right, my friends, I will see you guys on the flip side.
The Iranian Revolution overthrew the current government back in 1979. Students in support of the revolution took control of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking most of the American personnel hostage. I say most because 6 managed to escape. And the covert mission to bring them back to the United States? Well, that's the topic of today's video.
Yeah, the catalyst for that was that the Shah was sick, and we allowed him to come into the United States for treatment. And that was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back. But the Shah was a monarch, an absolute, dictator, and not a very good governor of this nation. We supported him. The British supported him. There were geopolitical reasons for doing so, unfortunately. Whether or not we feel very good about that is another question, because there had been an actual functioning democracy in Iran before that, but it all led to this, unfortunately.
Is the Canadian caper. The Islamic Iranian Revolution in 1979 saw the US-based Shah of Iran and his government overthrown and replaced by the Ayatollah Khomeini. In the chaos of revolution, a group of student revolutionaries stormed the US Embassy in Tehran, and on the 4th of November 1979 gained control of the embassy and took 52 American diplomats hostage. These 52 hostages would be held at the embassy compound for 444 days, finally being released in 1981 after the signing of the Algiers Accord. However,
I was in second grade at the time, and we used to do current events every morning where we would sit in a circle, and the teacher would talk about it. And I remember being intently interested in this, and we would have well wishes or prayers for the hostages. My parents always would sit around the breakfast table on weekends reading the newspaper, swapping them out for the New York Times and our local Long Island newspaper called Newsday, and having discussions about it. And I was just very, very interested in it. And those that year that they were held, to a little kid,
there were 6 staff that were left unaccounted for. 6 embassy personnel that somehow made it out in the chaos of that night. Actually, there were 2 groups that initially made it out that night. They were all working in the consulate building, which was another separate building on the embassy's compound, but it was the last to be attacked.
Initially, the 6 found refuge in a number of different locations, among them 2 West European embassies. Within a few days, though, they all made their way to the Canadian.
See, in Argo, that's a false depiction too. They acted as though there were no other allies that would take our citizens or offer them refuge, and that's just not true. I mean, obviously, we give the most credit to the Canadians for what they did to get them out and to provide them safe haven, but yeah, that's just
Canadian embassy.
So when the Iranians came over the compound wall, the 2 groups tore out onto the streets of Tehran with the orders of making it to the British embassy. The first group, led by the consul general, took an indirect route and ended up getting caught by a mob and returned to the compound. The second group was led by Robert Anders, and they took a more direct route. But when they got close to the embassy, they saw that there was a large crowd gathering there too, and so they decided to abort that plan. They were close to Robert's apartment, so they decided to go there for the night. Robert escaped that night with Cora Ambrin Lijek and her husband Mark Lijek, Joseph Stafford, and his wife Kathleen Stafford. The 5 spent the...
Are these real film footage? I mean, who filmed this? They look terrified.
Next 6 days hiding and sliding from house to house around Tehran, including going to a British residential compound for a night. But after only 3 days, the group heard that the Shah's government fell, and they knew their ordeal was going to take significantly longer. The revolutionaries would be looking for them if they realized that there were Americans that had escaped. So the question became, where do we hide? And how on earth do we get out of Tehran?
What happened?
What's interesting is, so I asked before who filmed this, and then you can just see at the top of that video, it's at ABC. So American Broadcasting Company, ABC News, I suppose. So I guess the revolutionary government did not take journalists or allow them to continue to film freely. I don't know.
6 of the hostages went out a back exit.
Where are they? The Canadian ambassador's house.
Got revolutionary guards going door to door.
Anders decided to reach out to an old friend and Canadian diplomat John Sheardown. On November 10th, 6 days since the takeover of the embassy, they got word of an enthusiastic welcome from the Canadians and quickly headed over to their house. There they met with John and his wife Zina, and to their surprise, the Canadian ambassador to Iran, Ken Taylor, was also there to welcome the group. Ambassador Taylor informed the Americans that Canada was going to do everything it could to protect them while in Iran and to work with the US State Department to get them back home to the United States.
The man's got guts. The ambassador himself, a high-profile person. Yeah, very brave. Very brave.
It was decided that Rob Anders and the Lijeks were going to stay with John and Zina, and the Staffords would be taken by Ambassador Taylor to stay at their home with his wife Pat. No one knew how long they were going to be hiding, and no one really knew what was happening back at the embassy, how many people were taken hostage, and how many might have escaped. Ambassador Taylor received a phone call a few weeks later from the embassy of Sweden. Apparently, one more American had escaped that night, Henry Lee Schatz, who had been sleeping on the floor of the Swedish embassy ever since. But it wasn't safe for him. The revolutionaries were now looking for escapees, and the Swedish ambassador thought that Lee could better impersonate a Canadian than a Swede if it actually came down to it. And Taylor agreed, sending Schatz to go stay at the Sheardown home. The Canadians would end up harboring the Americans in Tehran for a total of 79 days. But the real story...
That's a very good point. Yes, of course, the Americans could personate Canadians better than anybody. However, it was unknown, to what extent the Revolutionary Guard might search embassies or search embassy staff's homes and interrogate people. So it's not, they can impersonate a Canadian, but that will only stand up so long to interrogation.
The true caper is how we got them out. Ambassador Taylor placed a call back to Ottawa to Flora MacDonald, the Secretary of State for External Affairs, and to Prime Minister Joe Clark for help. They both immediately agreed with the effort to protect the Americans, and they promised to do whatever it took to get them out. The Canadian government worked closely with CIA exfiltration expert Tony Mendez to provide a cover story, documents, and other materials to make the escape possible. First, the Canadian government issued an order in council to official multiple copies of real Canadian passports with different fake identities for each of the 6 American diplomats in Canadian protection. The passports were real, but the CIA would then put a fake Iranian travel visa and an entry stamp into the passport to make it look like they've already been used to get into the country legally. CIA agent Mendez worked closely with Canadian agents in Ottawa to develop the story, and although they made a whole bunch of different identities for a variety of situations, the cover story that was eventually selected had the 6 diplomats pretending to be a Hollywood film crew, out scouting movie locations for a sci-fi film with a set on a planet with a Middle Eastern deserty feel called Argo.
I got an idea.
They're a Canadian film crew for a science fiction movie.
I fly into Tehran. We all fly out together as a film crew. I need you to help me make a fake movie.
So I believe that this YouTube gentleman who's doing this is Canadian. And in some ways, and I'm not really being critical because it's interesting, there's some credibility being lent to the movie by putting these scenes in it. And it's not as though the entire movie was false, but from what I understand, Mendez didn't arrive in Tehran until I think like the day or two before that they were going to leave, and so there was an exaggeration of the role. And I'm not I'm not trying to downplay the risk to him. I mean, of course, he risks his life, but so far, maybe because this isn't getting hugely into it, he said that Mendez worked with a number of agents in Ottawa. I would like to know a little bit more. Maybe it's unknown as to who those people were. But yeah, I'm perhaps being a little too harsh on my judgment. And
so you want to come to Hollywood and act like a big shot without actually doing anything?
Yeah.
You'll fit right in.
Don't get me wrong, Argo was a fake movie, and it was never going to be real. But it was the realest fake movie ever created. To make the cover story believable, Mendez enlisted the help of John Chambers, who was a veteran makeup artist from Hollywood. Together they set up an actual office on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles named Studio 6 Productions, a nod to the 6 diplomats they were working to rescue. They had someone sit in that office just in case anyone called to verify if the movie and the studio were real. They took out ads in LA newspapers, they hosted film parties at LA nightclubs, and they placed posters about the studio and the film in both Variety and Hollywood Reporter magazines. Just so that if anyone started to ask questions to anyone in Hollywood, they would probably be like, oh yeah, I've heard of Studio 6, and I think they're making that movie called Argo. This whole time, Canada was playing it cool with the Iranians and pretending nothing was wrong. But in the background, we were making plans to shut down our own embassy in Tehran, we were secretly flying out non-essential staff, and the American diplomats continued to pass their time in hiding playing cards and Scrabble.
That's so yeah, he's obviously Canadian. He's referring to you as we. Yeah, I mean, look, and they had to do that so covertly because the minute this was going to be realized, once these diplomats were smuggled out, it would be untenable for the embassy to remain open, and so they had to do all
Tensions
of that.
Started to rise when there was a flurry of activity outside the Canadian embassy, and some suspicious phone calls to both the Taylor and Sherdown residences made them think that they might have been discovered. It was time to go. But just before Mendez and a CIA colleague nicknamed Julio left for Iran, a Canadian staffer in Ottawa realized that they had made a mistake on the fake Iranian visas. The date that they had stamped on the visa was wrong, because the Iranian year starts in the spring and not in January. But luckily they had printed spare passports for everyone and were able to correct the mistake before heading to Iran. Tony Mendez and...
Wow. So I just want to get this straight. They said before that, Ken Taylor worked with the powers that be in Ottawa to get real Canadian passports, but then the CIA created the fake visas. So they got the dates wrong, making a mistake culturally, and the Canadians realized it before they were used.
Julio landed in Tehran in late January 1980, and they headed to the residence of Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor. There he met with the 6 diplomats, gave them their new Canadian passports and identities, and walked them through the backstory. They were a film crew. They had been in Iran for work, looking for locations for a film, and were headed back to Toronto via Zurich. So early morning on Sunday, January 27th, 1980, Mendez, Julio, and the 6 American diplomats arrived at the Tehran Mehrabad International Airport with their real Canadian passports and their fake Iranian entry visas. But they were able to make it through customs and security quite easily. However, their flight was delayed due to some mechanical difficulties, so they waited nervously, but eventually boarded Swissair Flight 363 and took off for Zurich. The Canadian caper had been pulled off successfully. After 79 days of hiding in the protection of the Canadian embassy in Tehran, the 6 diplomats were out of Iran and off to a CIA safe house in the mountains of Switzerland, free at last. Well, not quite. They were told that they were not going to be able to tell anyone that they were out. They had to protect the other 52 hostages still in Tehran and the networks of people that they were able to use to keep the 6 safe. But that's not what the rest of the world had planned. The very next morning, the moment they caught wind that the diplomats were safe and out of Iran, La Presse de Montréal broke the story on how Canada had protected the American diplomats and gotten them out. The Canadian caper was worldwide news. Canada immediately closed our embassy in Tehran, and Ambassador Ken Taylor and the rest of the staff headed back home, cutting all...
Yeah, look, guys, I mean, that's... yeah, of course, it's an exciting news story, but, news outlets just put lives in danger sometimes. That's irresponsible.
Diplomatic ties to the Ayatollah's government. The 6 diplomats didn't need to be in hiding anymore, so they were brought home to the US and arrived back on American soil on the 30th of January 1980. American crowds gathered around the country to thank Canada for what we had done. It came as a surprise to most, because no one in the public knew that anyone had escaped. Now, they knew that thanks to Canada, 6 diplomats were safe and back in the United States of America. Robert Anders, Mark and Cora Lijic, Joseph and Kathleen Stafford, and Henry Lee Schatz all made it home that day thanks to the incredible risks taken by their Canadian counterparts. And those Canadians involved were all awarded with the Order of Canada, including Mary O'Flaherty, Roger Lucy and Laverna Dollimore, who were all embassy staff, John and Zena Sheardown, and Ken and Patricia Taylor. Ambassador Taylor was also awarded the Congressional Gold Medal by the United States Congress for his assistance to the United States of America. If the movie title Argo sounds a little familiar to you, it's because it finally became a real movie back in 2012. Except it wasn't a sci-fi movie about space, it was the story of the Canadian caper, albeit without all the Canadian. The film dramatizes the events and focuses more on the role of the CIA, leaving out a lot of the details about Canada's direct role in making the rescue possible. For example, they completely omitted John and Zena Sheardown for reasons of length and cost, and they put all 6 diplomats at the Taylor residence. The film also states that the British and New Zealand embassies turned the Americans away, and that's not true. They were initially supposed to go to the British embassy, but the crowd outside made that impossible. And by the time they were with the Canadians, the British knew that Iranians were looking for them. So all of our allies in Iran agreed that the Canadians' residences were truly the safest places for them to be. The Canadian caper, or as it's known in the United States, Argo, is one of the most important chapters in the relationship between Canada and the United States. And if you guys want to see more stories about that special relationship between Canada and the US, let us know in the comments below and we'll be sure to make some of those videos. In the meantime, we're excited to see you next week,
Yes, sir,
and bye!
that. All right, my friends. Yeah, that was good. That was good, and I did like the way he explained the inaccuracies at the end, and underscored what the movie was and what the movie wasn't, and that was important. I remember my dad years ago. I wonder if he remembers. I'll ask him this when we're having a conversation about the special relationship with Britain, and he was saying that the Americans and British, I think, tend to look at that alliance post World War II as being something that has achieved a lot and that is extraordinarily important, and it is. But he said people sometimes underestimate or undervalue the alliances of other of our strategic partners around the world, and Canada was the one example that he really underscored and mentioned how they protected our people in the Iranian crisis. I think Australia also sometimes gets short shrift because they're a very important ally in the Pacific realm, in modern times against the influence of China, and ally to both of us, Canada and the United States, because we all have interests in the Pacific and counterbalancing China's ever expanding vies for power. And, the Australians have fought in pretty much every war alongside us ever since World War II, including Vietnam. And although for political reasons, and that I completely understand, Canada decided not to be in Vietnam, Canadians joined and fought in the American military in Vietnam, which I would like to do a video on at some point. But in any case, my friends, this was very interesting. And let's see if we can look at a brief video with Ken Taylor and hear some of his impressions directly from the man. Stay with me.
He said, well, I'll check with the ambassador, but why don't you think of coming here? So he came up, and we both thought that this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So I sent a message, what they call it,
back to Ottawa.
Charlie, back to Ottawa on a flash. As they say, you don't usually use a flash message in normal day diplomacy. A flash means that it strips right through the other messages coming in.
And what did it say?
It said what we intend to do is provide safety and shelter for 5 U.S. diplomats who made it out the side door. Would you concur? The reasons for doing this are apparent. It's a Canadian response to people in particularly U.S. diplomats in jeopardy. This went to the undersecretary, who immediately sought of some time with the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and they immediately said, yes, take them in, and however you manage it well, something along those lines. Yeah. Good luck.
And so how did they get there?
They were brought over they'd stayed one night at the British Embassy, and so a British Embassy driver brought them over to my colleague's house. There were 5 of them. So they came in and sat down. We said hello to each other, and just made themselves comfortable, had a drink or a coffee, whatever was soothing. And one of the diplomats, Mark Lechak, said to John Sheardown, said, well, does your ambassador know that we're coming to stay, and I'd like to thank him. He said, well, yeah, he's sitting next to you. At this time, some way or the other, I didn't seem to play the role of an ambassador very well. But and that started really 3 months.
Yeah, my friends, look, what can I say? This was a wonderful thing that your nation did for us, and there are so many heroes that are unsung and whose names aren't known behind the scenes. Ken Taylor certainly is the person who was out in the forefront and did a lot of interviews, and everybody knows him. Is he still alive? I'm not sure about that, but all these years later, I would like to thank him and his wife. I'd like to thank the Sheardowns, who didn't get any recognition in the movie, and every single other Canadian that had a role in this. This was amazing. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart all these years later. And I know if it happened again, you would all do the same thing. I'm positive of that. As would we. All right, my friends. Thank you for watching, and I will see you very soon. Have a great day and a wonderful week. Take care.